I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I have been following a gentleman by the name of Jeff Rubin for, I think, 3 decades now, as one of the top thinkers from an economic standpoint in the Canadian economy. He wrote a really interesting op-ed recently in the Globe Mail that we're going to talk about. He's got some strong opinions on the Canadian economy, the budget, etc. We're going to talk about that. He's a recent author. And Jeff, tell us the book that you've recently published. It's a map for the new normal or something like that.
A map of the new normal. And it was just recently a finalist for the National Business Book Award.
And it was a really interesting book talking about how geopolitics has changed, how the economy has changed, and how we've got to, really address these changes. And I think your op-ed argued that we're effectively not doing any of the above. So what do you think of the budget, sir?
Well, this is how I responded to the budget. Like many Canadians, I have a mortgage. I had what was called a 3-year variable flex mortgage, which allowed me to lock into a fixed rate 5-year mortgage at any time I wanted. When I saw the deficit number, and not just for the current year, but for the next 5 years, I immediately decided to lock in to a 5-year fixed rate. It was around 3.79, something around there. And the reason I did that, of course, is because, as you know, Brian, 5-year fixed rate mortgages are priced off the Government of Canada yield curve. And there is an enormous amount of issuance that the bond market is going to have to absorb here, unless the Bank of Canada is going to once again turn on the printing presses like they did with their quantitative easing program during the pandemic. But let's assume that they're not. That's a massive amount of issuance, and it's going to push bond yields higher, regardless of whether the Bank of Canada will cut rates again. And I think with this amount of fiscal stimulus, the bank's probably done cutting rates. But, in any event, we're looking at higher bond yields and hence higher mortgage rates. So from a homeowner's perspective, this was not a good news budget because, of course, not only are they facing slumping real estate values, but probably soon rising mortgage rates. Now, as for, the grand narrative of the budget, so-called generational change, the grand narrative is that all of this, $86 billion or so of new spending is going to trigger an avalanche of investment as much as $1 trillion over the next 5 years. Well, I'll short that trade, and let me tell you why, Brian. Because while I don't deny that, public sector investment can lever private sector investment, in joint funding efforts, you got to ask yourself, who would go right now and invest in a new plant in the Canadian aluminum or steel or auto or softwood lumber industry, knowing that you won't be able to sell anything produced in that plant to in the American market because of tariffs. So while, fiscal policy can be a substitute for monetary policy, fiscal stimulus can be a substitute for monetary stimulus. It's not a substitute for trade policy because we've got to get back to the whole issue of Canada is one of the most export dependent economies in the world, exports almost 40% of GDP. Three-quarters of that go to a country that's pretty well bent on shutting us out. We have to find some new trading partners in a hurry. Mark Carney has recently said that he wants to double non-US exports in the next 10 years. That's great. But I think he's looking in the wrong places because we're certainly not going to double them with where he's suggesting the EU. We've had a free trade agreement with the EU for the last 10 years. Exports have flatlined, and the reason is because it's not really a free trade agreement, because what really protects the EU are non-tariff barriers. I mean, try selling an Ontario-made car in the German car market, or try selling some Quebec cheese in the French or Italian market, and you'll get an appreciation of what I'm saying. If we are going to replace the US, the countries that can do that, that have the economic weight to do that, are the BRICS countries. I speak of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now recently joined Saudi Arabia, Iran. The two key countries here are India and China. And if you have any doubt as to their ability to shelter us from the storm, just look what they did for Russian energy exports. You may recall, Brian, President Biden, when he announced sanctions against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, said these were, the most crippling sanctions ever imposed and would bring the Russian economy to its knees. Well, that all turned out to be nonsense. I mean, Russia's energy export earnings hit record highs, and that's because India and China opened their vast energy markets with welcoming arms to sanction Russian fuel. If they did that for Russia, could they not also do that for Canada? Provide, a sanctuary from Trump's tariffs? They could, but the huge difference is, of course, that Russia's a geopolitical ally of China and India, and we have absolutely terrible relations with China and India. So if we're going to go down that path, we're going to have to recalibrate our foreign policy. And that's something that I don't think the majority of Canadians right now feel that comfortable with.
So what do you think Carney should have done?
Well, I mean, here's the problem. I mean, Carney should have, for example, dropped the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because we don't produce any electric vehicles anymore with the Ingersoll plant shut down, in exchange for them dropping the tariffs on canola, pork and seafood. That would be an initial step, but we got to do way more than that. I mean, if China and India are going to play the role for us that they did for Russia, we've got to basically sign free trade agreements with them. And the challenge is, and not just for Carney, because to be fair here, for any Canadian prime minister, right now, I don't think the electorate is prepared for that. These are countries, that we've spent the last couple of decades distancing ourselves from. We have, major issues, irritant issues with both India and China. The assassination of a Sikh activist in Canada, the incarceration of two Canadians in China for 2 years. There's context for that, by the way, as well. But we got a long way to go when repairing bilateral relations. And I'm not sure at this point that there would be public support for a move in that direction. For example, in a recent Angus Reid poll, and it was shown in the Globe article I wrote, showed that something like only 14% of respondents, favored greater trade with China, and I think like 4 or 5 with India versus 57, 58% with the EU. That just shows, how out of line the geopolitical is with the urgency of finding new trading partners. Now, Brian, give us another year of American tariffs, where the anger turns to fear, and we may find the Canadian electorate much more receptive to chasing the Indian and Chinese markets. But, in a world where trade is sort of fractured in geopolitical blocks, we're in the wrong block. So, we basically would have to become a BRICS country. If we did, I think that is a viable alternative to the American market.
Can we actually change which block we're in? Like, isn't geography gravitation? Aren't we wedded, better for worse, to the United States?
Well, I mean, for reasons of geography, of course, not to mention history. But I mean, if we're going to be facing 35% tariffs on non-CUSMA exports, 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Geography is not going to amount to much. I would point out that I think that China, for example, if you want to talk about geography, would love to get a foothold in North America. It was only about 10 years ago that actually, it is the current finance minister who was then handling the negotiations of a free trade agreement with China, which fell through. I'm sure they'd love to go ahead with that. And that certainly would not be the outcome that President Trump is hoping to achieve from his tariffs.
The non-tariff barriers that you indicated that we have with the EU, or the EU has with us, Pierre Trudeau Sr. Was trying to increase our trade with Europe. When was it? 50 years ago, and
That's
has
right.
talked about Canadian diversification of trade for a long period of time. Is there any opportunity, even if you say public opinion polls support increased trade with Europe? Is there any opportunity to increase that trade with Europe, or, as you say, is Asia, is China, is India the only options that we've got?
I think there's very limited opportunity to increase trade with Europe. And by the way, these EU economies aren't growing at, even a fraction of the rate of a China, a Brazil, an India, or for that matter, even Russia. You're talking about stagnant economies in no small measure, because of their own sanctions on Russian energy, particularly natural gas, that has sent power and energy prices skyrocketing. And this is a very protectionist culture here, firmly embedded. So, if you want to look at autos, for example, Germany exports 10 times the amount of vehicles to Canada that Canada exports to Western Europe. So I wouldn't be too hopeful there. As I say, we've had a free trade agreement for the last 10 years, and exports to the EU and the UK are pretty well flatlined at 10%.
So I
So,
had Jim Stanford formerly of the Canadian Auto Workers on my
Jim?
show a week ago, and he was saying that we should go back to sort of the 1960s auto pack, where you give people access to your market if they buy as much as they sell. Would you support that? Saying to Germany, if you're going to sell X number of cars to Canada, fine, but you got to buy that same number of cars to.
You know what? I couldn't agree more, and that's exactly where we're probably going to, back to the future, because CUSMA, the Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement, is a dead man walking. It will not get renewed when it comes up for mandatory review next year because Donald Trump isn't interested in renewing that. So, all of a sudden, we're going back to the world that existed, before the Auto Pact, where there was hardly any cross-border trade, even though the firms in the industry were the same. It was General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, but they operated independently. And then, of course, the Auto Pact, what the Auto Pact did was it guaranteed Canadian production equal to car sales. And what that allowed for is a whole change in the way that auto firms operated. They could specialize in producing one or two models and produce for the entire North American market. Before, they would produce, in small production runs, all the cars produced in Canada. So the result was that due to a lack of scale economies, productivity was about a third lower in Canadian auto plants than in American auto plants, and consumers had a much narrower choice of model selection. So that's probably the world where we're going back to, and certainly that could be applied to Audi, Mercedes, BMW. If you want to sell cars in this market, you have to produce them. I'll guarantee you they'll be doing that in the United States to avoid the tariffs that Trump will be imposing on them.
It's sort of a strategy pretty comparable to what Donald Trump is trying to extract from all the different countries he's negotiating free trade agreements with.
Exactly. And, I mean, if Donald Trump said that NAFTA was a disaster for for the American auto industry, it was an even bigger disaster for the Canadian auto industry. It's just that no one seemed to care in Ottawa about Canadian auto workers. They were more concerned about Magna shareholders and how much money Magna could save by moving production to Mexico. But, back in the day, back in 2004, Canada produced almost 3 million vehicles, like double what it produces now. And Ontario surpassed Michigan as the largest manufacturer of vehicles on the continent. How things have changed. We've just seen a total mass exodus of production. But, Trump's tariffs are to bring those jobs back. And I think he's doing an excellent job. I think, this is a great news story for American auto workers. If tariffs can bring back jobs and investment in the U.S. auto industry, then guess what? Tariffs can bring back the same in the Canadian auto industry. Obviously, not on the scale of what's happening in the U.S., but yes, I mean, all of a sudden, if GM, Chrysler, Stellantis, or Ford, faces a 25-30% tariff selling their cars into Canada, they're going to have to produce those cars in Canada. Now, it may be in short, inefficient production lines compared to what existed in the past, but that's better than no production at all.
So
So, yeah,
you got to
yeah.
tell me something then. With the whole elbows up attitude and lots of talk about tit for tat negotiations, and you got to have reciprocal tariffs to fight to Trump. We haven't had reciprocal tariffs. So
No,
is that a
and
mistake? Should we
well,
have them?
whether we were, well, I mean, I think we will have to have reciprocal tariffs if Kuzma is scrapped. Carney's, still dreaming that Kuzma will be renewed, or at least that's what he's telling Canadians. But if Canadians listen to what President Trump and his officials are saying, it's unlikely that Kuzma will be renewed. But in terms of retaliation, tit for tat, I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying that in big picture terms, we're going to lose. Okay. And we're going to lose not because of the negotiating skill of Prime Minister Carney, we're going to lose because of the cards he's holding. He's holding a losing hand. And the reason for that is economics, not sort of the political maneuvering of leaders. And the economics is really simple. The American market is, way more important to the Canadian economy than the Canadian market is to the U.S. economy. I mean, not even remotely close. Okay, exports are 3 to 4 times more important in Canada than they are in the U.S. And three-quarters of our exports go to the U.S. So we're going to lose. That's why we got to find new options. That's why BRICS is an answer. And if Russia could survive the loss of West European natural gas markets, which was its bread and butter, we should be able to survive the loss of American markets. But we have to have a trade alternative. And right now, we don't have one. So yes, I mean, sure, we can retaliate. And in the case of autos, I think that would be particularly apropos to try to get some investment in the industry here. But in big picture terms, we're going to lose the trade war against the United States because we need them a whole lot more than they need us. I mean, Trump's right. They don't have to import cars or aluminum or softwood lumber or steel. The only thing that they need to import from Canada is oil. And that's a separate issue.
We're chatting with Jeff Rubin today about his thinking about the Canadian economy. He's written a really interesting book about how things have changed. It's called The Map for the New Normal. He's written a recent op-ed in the Globe and Mail that was really quite hard-hitting about what Canada needs to do. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Jeff Rubin, one of Canada's, if not Canada's, top economists in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got Jeff Rubin, former chief economist with one of Canada's major banks, now an author of an incredibly interesting book called The Map of the New Normal. And he's talking about the Canadian economy, the Canadian budget, where we got to go with us today. Jeff, when I read your book, I got the impression that you thought things had changed geopolitically fairly dramatically, that this era of free trade and dramatically increases in amounts of trade worldwide was over, and that you sort of had to pick which block you were going to be part of, which is sort of what we've been chatting about for the last couple of minutes. And so I got to ask you why. We had this huge amount of increase in productivity, of economics, of prosperity, what is it, 1 billion people coming out of poverty in China. We had an era of incredible growth worldwide. Free trade seemed to be working. Why is it over? Why has it changed? Why do we have to think about things differently today?
Okay, well, first, Brian, you're absolutely right. The casualty of sanctions, and that began before Trump, that began with Biden. Trump's taken it to another level with tariffs, but started with Biden. The real casualty here was not the Russian economy. The real casualty was the so-called, rules-based trading order championed by, the World Trade Organization. And you're right, globalization, something incidentally that we were told repeatedly was not only in our interests, but was inevitable and immutable, suddenly isn't so inevitable and immutable. It's now in the dustbin of history. Why? Well, it did work great, Brian, for China. I mean, China's inclusion in the WTO around 2001 was probably the most significant thing that's happened to the global economy and certainly to the Chinese economy. Who it was not great for, and these are the people that have been championed by the most unlikely of champions for them, Donald Trump, is the middle class, because the middle class got hollowed out. The manufacturing sector got hollowed out. because now, you could produce the same thing at a fraction of the cost. And when workers tried to go on strike for a higher pay, you could just close the factory and, find a supplier in China. And it worked great for consumers because all of a sudden the cost of everything was that much less. And as inflation fell, so did interest rates. So there were all kinds of benefits, except for the middle class. And you talk about GDP growth. Well, you know what? For the middle class, GDP growth didn't mean anything. It was an abstraction. It never filtered down to them. Sure, income per capita rose, but not their income per capita. The top 20% had huge gains, so it made the average income per capita look like it was rising. The middle class was left behind and left for dead, and not just in the United States. I mean, equally true of Canada or Australia or Western Europe. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump changed that. I mean, tariffs had no constituency among the economic community at all, but Donald Trump didn't care what economists had to say. And from for his constituency, the middle class, Donald Trump was 100% correct. So the trade-off that globalization involved was, we'd get low inflation, but, we wouldn't have a middle class anymore because we wouldn't make goods anymore. Well, that's been reversed. Okay. We are getting those jobs back, jobs that President Obama or Hillary Clinton said we'd never get back. And we are starting to see, investment in the manufacturing sector like we haven't seen in decades.
In the United States,
In the United States, yes,
not
yes.
in Canada.
No, as a result of these tariffs. Although, Brian and I, we talked about going back to the auto pact. If we put a 25-30% tariff on car imports into Canada, I guarantee you there'd be investment because they'd have to, GM would have to retool that Oshawa plant that hardly makes anything anymore. I think it still makes a Silverado. And it would have to start making, 9, 10 different models that GM wants to sell in Canada, but can't supply from its US plants because of the tariffs. But right now, that's not happening, but it is happening in spades in the US, whether it's the steel industry, the aluminum industry, or the auto industry.
People keep telling us that there's no way that you can adapt, that it's going to cost billions of dollars and take 10 years to build a new steel plant or aluminum plant or car plant or something like that. How can you be right that Trump tariffs are bringing jobs back to the United States?
Well, just look at all the investment announcements that you're seeing from automakers, whether they're Japanese automakers or German automakers in the U.S. market, and you are seeing increases in U.S. production as a lot of production has been moved from Canada to the U.S. Like, for example, the Silverado that was being made in Oshawa. Well, they've just added some new shifts in the Fort Wayne, Indiana plant. So you are seeing production move to the U.S.
So let me ask you a question. Let's take a step back if we could.
Uh,
If a company had 75% or 80% of its business with one customer, any banker at CIBC or BMO or something like that would say you're over reliant on one customer, and I'm not going to take credit risk with you. We've had 75 or something percent of our trade with one customer, and it's now in jeopardy. Going back to 1988, John Turner and Brian Mulroney had this big debate about free trade. It was the free trade election. John Turner argued against free trade and said that if you give up your economic sovereignty, ultimately your political sovereignty will be put at risk. Was he right? Was Brian Mulroney wrong? Was free trade a mistake because we became too wedded, too dependent on U.S. trade? And we took the easy way out for 50 years, where we traded with someone a couple hundred miles south of us, rather than doing the difficult job of creating economic opportunities to grow our industries in Europe or in Asia.
well, it's always dangerous to judge people in a different time context. There's no question that since the free trade agreement for the last 40 years has seen the ever increasing integration of the Canadian economy into the US economy. And, that speaks, you mentioned geography earlier in the show. Well, it's only natural that that occur given the geography. Now, was Mulroney right? Was Turner right? I mean, here's the thing. The US took a 180-degree turn, okay? Donald Trump was the new normal. It's a very different normal than had existed for the 40 years since we signed that trade agreement up until his first presidency. So, you know, things were going not well for the auto industry, but as a whole for the Canadian economy, things were going quite well. In the sort of integrated globalist model with the U.S. But then, the ball changed, and I guess in ways that were never imagined. I mean, don't forget that, going back to 2016, first of all, the media said that Trump could never get the Republican nomination. Then the media said didn't stand a chance against Hillary Clinton. And then, the media said, oh, he wouldn't get reelected, even though, he not only got reelected, but took the House and Senate as well. So, this is black swan event or whatever you want to call it, but this was not anticipated by the mainstream.
So
You
some
know,
people are saying, let's just wait for the midterms or just let's wait for
yeah.
2028. What do you think about that?
Okay, well, let's wait for the midterms because the Democrats aren't exactly hitting it out of the park, and this shutdown that they've engineered isn't endearing them to a lot of voters. At some point, the Democrats will come back. They need to find, a new voice, like a Bill Clinton type of guy coming out of the woodwork. But Trump has moved the needle. I mean, look at the Republican Party. It's not sort of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. The MAGA wing is the Republican Party. And, he's changed the way people think. So that, whether he's succeeded by the vice president or Rubio or, whoever of his administration, I think is very much going to carry the day that, tariffs and protectionism is the new normal. And, I think that that's going to outlast Donald Trump. And we here in Canada, can't roll the dice, listening to CNN and, how the Democrats are going to just, sweep in the midterms, just like they were their other calls about Trump in past elections. We can't roll the dice. We gotta find other options. We gotta lessen our dependency on the U.S. economy. Carney's right. I mean, it's not something that you can do overnight. But the big priority here should not be appeasing Donald Trump. The big priority here should be repairing relations with China and India.
Well, so Carney was over in Asia recently. He met with both the head of India as well as Xi in China, as
No,
well as South Korea and other places. Isn't that the right strategy, or
it's
just too
it's
little, too late?
I don't too little. It's a small step in the right direction, but like if you want to talk about China, that 100% electric car vehicle tariff is still there, and Canadian farmers are losing billions of dollars in sales. So, I would have hoped that, Carney would have come to an agreement with Xi right then and there, saying we don't manufacture any electric vehicle anymore since the Ingersoll plant has been closed because of American tariffs, by the way. So we're dropping that. But that's only, even that is only a small step because, you know, we got to get China to do for us what they did for Russia. We got to, like, not just maintain trade with China. We got to get China buying everything that's being tariffed in the United States. I mean, they could if they were properly incented. And here we got to get back to the whole geopolitical orbit. If we offer China a free trade agreement and a foothold in North America, that would be a game
Do
changer.
we, Jeff, do we have goods they want? I'm in business. I'm dealing with a company that flies twice a week from China to Canada, stops in two different airports filled with goods that people are buying, fast fashion and other things. They then fill up with lobster and fly back to China. The only thing that the planes are flying back to China with is lobsters.
Well, they aren't anymore because China's put a huge tariff on our lobsters in retaliation to the electric vehicle. But China is it's the world's largest consumer of resources. And we, along with Russia, are, the world's largest resource producer, whether we're talking, oil and gas, whether we're talking uranium, whether we're talking grain, whether we're talking peas and lentils. I think it's a very good fit, and one that I think China would be very willing to do. But you know, um, the Canadian public isn't going to change their attitudes towards China and India, which have been, constantly maligned in the Canadian media. That's not going to change overnight. So I get back to my question. Even if Carney was so inclined, and I don't know if he is, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that he is so inclined to move in a BRICS direction. Is there political support for that in Canada among the electorate right now?
In your book, you talked about this new normal. Geopolitical was one of them. What were some of the other changes that you thought
Well,
were happening that we needed to adapt to?
well, I mean, there is a war going on. It's an economic war between BRICS and the United States. And by the way, sanctions aren't a one-way street. They're a two-way street because the US has been sanctioned. Its currency has been sanctioned. And its currency has been sanctioned by some of the largest central banks in the world. You notice the U.S. trade weighted. I mean, they've gone up against Canada, but they've basically fallen. And one of the reasons they've fallen is that there has been massive selling of U.S. dollars by BRICS central banks, in particular the People's Bank of China. And it's one of the factors underlying the strength of gold because that's become a substitute. And this was all sort of brought on by the US itself because when they confiscated some $300 billion of dollar assets held by Russia's central bank, what President Biden didn't realize was that he was undermining one of the pillars that had made the US dollar the reserve currency of the world. And that was that, it was viewed as an insurance policy, a safe haven. Well, now all of a sudden it could become a ticking time bomb because at any point the White House could decide to confiscate those dollar reserves. And there's no way a central bank could hedge that risk except not hold US dollars. I mean, the same thing happened when they wouldn't allow Russia to use the dollar for its natural gas and oil exports, and Russia instead chose the ruble. Well, up until the Ukrainian conflict, some 90% of oil and gas was traded in US dollars. That's no longer the case. When the largest energy importer, China, and the largest oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, are no longer conducting their business in dollars, that's a change too. So, sanctions aren't just, we just hear about what we're imposing on Russia or China, but believe me, it's a two-way street.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Jeff Rubin talking about how things have changed. What's the new normal? And he's the author of a great new book, an author of an op-ed recently in the Globe and Mail that's really challenged us to think about a map of the new normal and where Canada needs to go. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got economist and author Jeff Rubin with us tonight. Jeff, what's the title of the book, please?
It's called A Map of the New Normal.
And where can people get it?
In any bookstore, Amazon, it's available.
Appreciate you joining us today. I've got to ask you, if I could, to go back to your comments about the substantial investments in the budget. And given what you've described and the challenges that we've got, and Canada's been challenged economically before. It was challenged with people prior to Confederation thinking that we should join the United States. And Johnny MacDonald had the national railways that he talked about. We were challenged in the 1890s when McKinley, who Trump seems to emulate, talked about Canada joining the United States, and we ended up having big infrastructure spending at that point in time. Don't you think, whether it's the major projects office, the pipelines that we're talking about, the liquefied natural gas, the investment in defense, etc., that are causing the increase in the deficit? Aren't those smart things to do?
Well, let's talk about pipelines because I think pipelines is the equivalent of building the Transcontinental Railway in Sir John A. Macdonald's time. It is the issue, probably the most important issue for the Canadian economy. Mark Carney likes to talk of Canada as an energy superpower. And he'll cite the fact that we have the third largest oil reserves and maybe the fourth, fifth largest natural gas reserves. But it takes more than natural endowments to become an energy superpower. It takes political will to develop those resources. Now, if you look at countries that are legitimate energy superpowers, countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Russia, countries like the United States, they have the political will to build the required infrastructure. We have sadly lacked. And that's why we produce half of what those countries produce in oil production. And what we do produce, we have to accept a huge discount from world prices because our oil is trapped. It's trapped into the US market. And the only way that we're going to get out of that trap is by building pipelines to Tidewater. Now, you notice in Carney's, list of projects that he's going to fast track, noticeably absent is such a pipeline. And the reason for that is that in this country, First Nation groups and provinces have effective veto power over new pipeline construction, and they haven't been shy about using it. That's going to have to change. Or I think that we're going to see, an internal political challenge, the likes of which we have not seen since the Quebec referendum, because I think that we're forcing Alberta into a position that it has not taken in the past, but may take in the future.
So Danielle Smith is right.
If Danielle Smith does not advance the referendum, somebody else will. Like nature, politics abhors a vacuum. And from Alberta's perspective, as a as a person who's lived in Toronto all my life, I totally empathize with Alberta's perspective. The lack of pipelines has frustrated the development of their most important economic resource, if not the country's most important economic resource, and that is the oil sands. And the very provinces that have blocked that are the same provinces that Alberta must support through equalization payments. I don't think that's a sustainable arrangement going forward, particularly when you have an expansionist US president in the White House. I don't know about Canada becoming the 51st state, but if the status quo doesn't change on pipelines, don't rule out the prospect of Alberta becoming the 51st state because Trump's already on record as saying, he's in favor of bringing back the mothballed Keystone XL pipeline that Biden canceled.
Okay, so pipelines have got to be part of the
Absolutely.
infrastructure expenditure. What about the balance of, people are talking about critical minerals. They're talking about liquefied natural gas. They're talking about lots of other developments. Aren't those the right things
LNG,
to invest in?
LNG, LNG is certainly something that we need to do and have done, and there'll probably be an expansion in Kitimat. But the U.S. have coined it by replacing pipeline Russian gas with LNG exports from the Gulf to Europe. Why can't we get involved in that? Well, we can't get involved in that because we don't have a pipeline that would take LNG to the East Coast. And again, that remains something that lies outside of the doable. But failure to build the kind of infrastructure that I'm talking about makes, in my opinion, a mockery of the claim that we're an energy superpower because it takes more than natural endowments to be an energy superpower.
I can't let you go without asking about real estate. You started by talking about the impact on your own personal mortgage. 60% of Canadian mortgages roll over in the next 18 months, supposedly.
Right, from
Just
from record lows. I mean, my mortgage was 1.95 that came due because I, like many people, locked in during the pandemic. And as you mentioned, 60% of those mortgages are coming up, and they're not going to be refinanced anywhere close to that. And I think with the amount of government borrowing and its impact on the bond market, that fixed rate mortgages are going to rise. So, Brian, that's not generally helpful for the real estate market. And, I think it'll continue to be, at least for the foreseeable future, tough sledding.
so you called the 1990 crash in real estate that hardly anyone else was thinking about coming, and you called it right. We've had a decline in real estate pricing in Canada. Is it going to be worse or is it going to get better? Some people are saying that the supply increases are so low that building starts are so low that actually it's going to go the opposite direction in 2028, 29. What's your sense of the real estate market in Canada, sir?
But don't forget that immigration was a huge driver of real estate prices, and that's changed. Um, I'm not particularly positive on the real estate market. I'm not saying that we're going to have like a 1990 crash. As you pointed out, we've already seen, particularly in the condo market, places like Vancouver and Toronto, significant declines. But I don't see the budget's impact on bond yields being supportive of the real estate market because I think it's going to have a negative impact on fixed rate mortgages.
So where do you put your money today?
Well, the stock
Gold?
market the stock market's doing just fine. Ironically, the Canadian market because of gold, but the S&P 500, the Nasdaq is doing fine, and it's doing fine because the one surprise is that we have not seen maybe it's too early, but we have not seen the big inflationary fallout from Trump's tariffs. To be sure, inflation is no longer 2%. It's 3%, and it's probably going to stay there. But, people were expecting, you know, huge increases in inflation from these tariffs, assuming that the tariffs would just be passed on and not eaten, and that's proven to be incorrect. So that's kept interest rates in check, and that's, I think, created a lot of blue sky for the stock markets. Whether that continues to be the case, we'll see. It's gonna it's going to depend on inflation. And right now, the big mystery or anomaly is tariffs have not had the inflationary impact that certainly their critics were calling for.
Jeff Rubin, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I highly recommend you follow Jeff Rubin. You buy his book. He is one of the best thinkers in Canada, someone who I've enjoyed following for a long period of time. Jeff, remind us the title of the book, please.
A Map of the New Normal.
And his op-ed in the Globe and Mail from a week or so ago is extremely well worth reading. That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Good night.